Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for your patience. We are eager to have you all joining our Heroes webinar. And our focus today is on first responders, particularly in the fire service, as well as EMS professionals. I am joined by several panelists and wanted to let folks know that as they enter in, I will be sure to introduce them. But first, a couple of logistics for those of you who have not ever attended a webinar for us, or you just need a refresher. This webinar is being recorded so that we can share it with folks who are perhaps unable to join us at this time. And that certainly includes each of you if you'd like to view it at a later date. We typically post these up on our YouTube channel within about a week. Second thing I wanted to call your attention to is at the bottom, there is a chat feature as well as a question and answer feature, and we would encourage you to submit your questions as well as tell us what else you'd like to talk about. That would be fantastic. And then the final thing that I would offer, hey there, Michael, the couple other final reminders is that we are able to, in this webinar, if people have some comments they'd like to come off mute, we can certainly make that happen. Just let us know in the chat or raise your hand. And the last thing I'd like to call your attention to is that there is on the bottom scroll part with Zoom here, right where you see the chat and resources, is this resources tab. It has links to our website as well as an overview of what we're doing and some basic bios of our speakers. So that's what we've got there in the resources for you. I want to then let folks know that unfortunately, one of our panelists, Christian Yakula from the St. Louis Fire Department, let me know this morning that due to an unexpected emergency, he is unable to join us. We all know what that's like in this line of work. So I have some of his talking points that he wanted to make sure were included, and we'll have to catch him next time. And we certainly hope he and his crew, personal as well as his fire department, are safe in that. And then our second panelist, Julie Nelson, is in the process of rejoining on a different device, so she'll hopefully be here with us any moment. But with that, I am going to go ahead and introduce our first panelist, Michael Happ. Thank you so much for joining us. I really actually am excited to tell people how I met Michael, and that is through another dear friend of mine, Jackie, at the Denver Fire Department. And Jackie is a strong advocate for employee wellness. And we got to talking about what it means to have healthy and well departments, and then specifically what it means to have that in training. And I remember her saying, like, oh, you gotta meet this guy. Like, he totally is down on this content. And I was actually on vacation when we first talked on the phone, Michael. I remember specifically where I was walking around as we were connecting. I feel like we hit it off right away. And then from there, we've been collaborating on all sorts of little projects here and there. And so I'm really great to have you. As folks to know that Michael serves as the wellness resiliency coordinator for the Denver Fire Department. He is deeply passionate about wellness. And his goal is to make sure that resiliency tools are not just available, but they're accessible and culturally relevant for every member of the fire department. And Michael, as I would love you to just briefly say a little bit about yourself. And I actually don't think I know this. How many years have you been in the fire service?
Altogether about 20. I've been with Denver for 15. Prior to that, I was active duty military. I was a firefighter in the military as well.
That's right. That's right. And so I am wondering if you wouldn't mind starting off to kind of share with our group. Our content here today is why the health and wellness of people working in fire departments and EMS, why that should matter for everybody. That's our goal here, is for people to make that connection and link. But you and I both know that I think one of the things that counteracts the resiliency in the fire department culture is the stigma. And that one of the most common stigmas is that people think like, well, if I share about what's happening, in my mental health and my recovery, then that means my career is over, right? And then I won't get the help that I need and my career is over. And you're a real strong advocate against that. I'm curious if I could hand it over to you and just share a little bit about your journey and what it looks like for you today.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Michael Happ. I'm a Denver firefighter. I have been on my 16th year now. I have been in this position as the resilience coordinator for just under 2 years. And this is not a position I ever thought that I would find myself in. I imagined that I was going to be some, firefighter retiring off the back of a busy rig that I always dreamed of, and to a degree, I had made that. I'd actually begun to live that plan. And where things kind of went wrong for me was when that plan didn't really work out because other things in life got in the way. So I always like to point out that like I bang the drums for wellness and resilience now, but I can't pretend like I was always that guy. I was that guy who was always coming in like, oh, firefighter mental health is important and wellness is important, right? I would have told you a lot of this stuff was bunk just a few years ago, if I'm being honest. But I hope what I do hope is that helps me connect with some folks though who might be on that side of things as well, because it wasn't an uncommon view by any stretch. So uh, yeah, and then what happened was the same thing that happens to everybody. I have this plan set out for how my life is going to go, right? I made it to the back of truck one, working downtown. I'm on special operations. I'm diving. I'm doing high angle. I'm doing all the fun things. And I was like, man, you're gonna have to pull my dead body off of the back of this rig. And then they almost had to pull my dead body off the back of that rig, but not because I had been there working so hard for so long, because I had gotten extremely out of shape, because my mental health had deteriorated to a point where I was, experiencing depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation. I was a full blown alcoholic, consuming, well over a fifth a day. And so it was just, it was for the wrong reasons that I ended up having to leave that rig. Um, and so that is sort of the genesis of how I ended up here. I went through rehab, had a successful stint there, learned a lot kind of about this mental health space that I had never been familiar with, and I determined, once I got out, and had put some distance between me and the what happened before, that I was going to try to make this into a positive experience for everybody, because I knew that I wasn't the only firefighter experiencing what I was experiencing. I wasn't the only person out there. The one time at the end of my rope when I finally decided to reach out for help, couldn't find any, and not due to lack of friends trying and people wanting to. It just wasn't as readily available as it should have been. So now that's my goal here, is to make sure that it is readily available and easily accessible for all of our firefighters.
Thank you so much. And you said something in your intro that I want to highlight, which you said, if I'm being honest, and let's be honest, this whole webinar, because that's what people want to hear, is the real deal. And nobody knows how to smell a little bit of BS better than first responders. So, and since you have all first responders in your panelist here, except for me, and in our attendees, and folks who've just perhaps joined us, just as a reminder, we have a chat feature as well as a Q&A feature. We'd love to hear from you. I'm guessing that folks here who are attending or who are going to watch this later on download have either can relate personally or have friends and colleagues of theirs can really relate to Michael's story around, like, you're gonna have to pull me off this rig, but that an unattended mental health substance use challenges really shift that. And I think your story, Michael, I just want to say thank you, because it takes, I know you've shared that story multiple times, and but it never ceases to amaze me, the courageous vulnerability that it takes to say, here's my story, and I hope it helps others. I hope it elevates people to say, recovery is possible. It's never too late, and you can, go back and make a difference. So thank you so much. And Jules, I'm so happy to see your wonderful face, and glad that you were able to connect in. And I'm going to give a really polished, stuffy introduction of you, and then I'd like you to hand it over to loosen that up, and you give a real intro of yourself, including your own kind of wellness journey in this field. But I actually shared right before you hopped on that I loved how I met Michael, and I shared that. And how I met Julie was that she is and currently still is a student of mine, because Julie's passion for health and wellness is so expanded that she is now about to finish her master's degree, to become a master's level counselor specifically for military and emergency responders. And I'm a faculty there at Colorado State University Global in their MERP program. And that's how we met. And it really only takes, I actually specifically remember the discussion board that we were on, and we were jamming on some health and wellness stuff. And you were about to go take a kind of a break with some family. And we just got on this great conversation. And I just remember thinking, I really enjoy just listening to this person and hearing what they have to share. And I think ever since then we've been finding lots of ways to collaborate and try to bring other people into our exuberant excitement about the health and wellness for this field. But it's also important to know that she, in addition, works for South Metro Fire and Rescue, firefighter paramedic, correct? That's the current title. And I think one of the things that to know Julie is to know that she is always ready to meet people right where they're at. And then she's always thinking about how to make things better going forward. Like both of those are happening really strong at the same time, all the time. So, Julie, I want to hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tucker. Gosh, where do I begin? So I suppose it starts in 1997. I had gotten out of high school and I really wanted to work for Outward Bound as a outdoor instructor, and you had to have your EMT in order to do that. So I went out and I got my EMT, and then partway through the class, I found out that that was the minimum I needed to work on an ambulance. And so I was like, wow, well, that sounds really fun. I think I might try that for a while. And so I got my first job as an EMT at 18. And then I was about 3 months into my career and I experienced the first suicide loss of a coworker. And I remember going to his funeral and it was so profoundly impactful. And I remember thinking like, wow, this is an intense field. And that was my first suicide loss in the job, but I've had 8 over the years at different agencies that I've had the opportunity to work for. And I think for me, it's interesting. There's a saying in the fire service that you can never train too much for a job that can kill you. And while I agree with that, when I look at it really from a statistical perspective, our greatest risk to ourselves is ourselves. And I think that we're so largely untrained for many of the things that we will encounter in this job, and some of that is, chronically holding space with the dying, handling the emotional component, and then the chronic hyperarousal that this job really trains into you in a very Pavlovian conditioned response. And so I've worked for South Metro. This is I'll hit 20 years in August, and I've had an amazing experience. They've been great. But over my career, I would say, let's see, I think it was in 2008, I went to a paramedic refresher at Swedish, and this woman came in, and it was psych after lunch on the second day. And I remember thinking, who planned this? Like, medics hate psych. And like after lunch, second day, like bad planning, literally, I remember thinking that, like, I was so cynical about it. And this woman came like just swirling into the room, and she was an older woman, and she said, I have worked in interventional psych for 60 years, or for 40 years, I'm sorry, 40 years, and I wish I were younger because we are on the precipice of understanding so much about the brain. And literally, she just captivated me for the next hour, going off about neuroscience and brain and memory storage and talking about EMDR and trauma. And she was so, like, I remember thinking, like, stop the train. What kind of crazy person works in interventional psych for 40 years and wishes they were younger because they'd like to have a longer career? I just remembered like thinking like, I've never heard anything that crazy. And but her passion was so exuberant. She really lit this little spark inside of me and this curiosity. And I'd been a paramedic for about 10 years at that point. And I've worked in some pretty hard areas, and I've always kind of been a black cloud. And so I got curious about EMDR, and I was working at South Metro then, and we had an EAP program, but you'd rather like admit that you had a crack problem than like say, I'm going to go see a shrink. So I found a therapist in Boulder who did EMDR, and I was like, can I pay you cash under the table? Nobody needs to know, that kind of thing. And I said, I've heard about this EMDR, and I definitely have some calls that I'd like to just, dump out of the backpack, so to speak. And she said, well, sure. Why don't you make a list of kind of all the calls that you don't like to talk about? And so I wrote down about 24 traumatic calls, dead babies, small plane crashes, all these things. And she kind of said at the beginning, she said, well, this is a little bit like Pandora's box. Like, once we get in there, we want to really commit to getting through it, or else it can be kind of dysregulating. And I remember kind of hesitating and thinking, I don't know if I need this. I'm just like everybody else. I drink too much. I sleep like garbage. I'm cynical about my patients. I have a lot of gallows humor. Like, that's all normal. That means you're seasoned, right? And so, and she said, well, it can work a lot faster than that. And so anyway, I did 5 total sessions of EMDR, and I felt like I unloaded a train car of just baggage. And so over the years, I shared that with different coworkers, and I became part of peer support. And then, just over, I think I've responded to 2 different mass shooting events and lost some other close friends. And then I started the CSU program. I'm only 47, but this is my 29th year in EMS. So I need to change it up at some point, and I'm really passionate. So I'm excited to talk to you all today, and thanks for letting me have all that airtime. I know that was a long diatribe.
It was totally worth it. And again, one of the things that we that I we bake into our curriculums at Heroes is that it has to be by responders for responders. And so we want to elevate the voice of responders every time, all the time. And as some folks on this call know, I was checking out some of the names of the attendees, is that when it comes to elevating the health and wellness in your agency, having people with lived experience really just can cut through a lot of institutional stigma. So thank you so much for being vulnerable to share. And I do just want to, let folks know that I popped a couple of things into the chat for our folks who are attending. um, there is no expectation to respond. If you feel comfortable, feel free to introduce yourself and where you're from. And I also just really wanted to highlight that Julie was talking there about EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy. Happy to share more resources, but I feel strongly that every department should have access to licensed, qualified, competent counselors, including some who are certified in EMDR. And we can talk and share more about that if folks are interested. Thank you all so much. And one of the things that I want to bring the background is, as a psychologist, and my board certification is in public safety. I really want to just back up some of the stuff that Michael and Julie were saying with some research. And I know that people listening to this webinar already know that there's some issues in this field. You probably wouldn't be on this call if you didn't already know that. But did you know that firefighters and people working in this type of first responder have a 72% higher rate of dying by suicide than the rest of the US population? That's unacceptable, right? Death by suicide is unacceptable. And to have a 72% higher rate than the US population, I mean, the US population, people at health departments across the world are already worried about the death by suicide rate and the mortality rate by suicide in the general public. And so to really say that it's so much higher in firefighters and EMS, really hits home. And I think also just sharing, both of you mentioned some substance use stuff. Again, nothing that people are going to be shocked about, but grounded in research, is that research indicates that approximately 50% of career firefighters engage in heavy or binge drinking within any given 30-day period. And when we're talking about then, some people will be like, "Ha, I think that's really low, Abigail." And some people might think that's really high, but we can jam out on research, and that the more you research, the more you realize you don't know. But here's what I do know, and that is that whether that is 50% or it's a little bit higher, a little bit low, that's why it also matters for everybody, right? I mean, that clinically concerns me for the health and wellness of this workforce, but it's also very concerning for the outcomes that they have. And so I know we've already had a chance to meet our 2 amazing guests and hear their lived experience, but really just wanted to share, as we shift now to kind of the cost of silence, is that we're talking about resiliency, and something that I like to say is that we know that resiliency isn't just like, oh, take a bubble bath and try not to think about it. I mean, those are placating comments that don't really speak to the gravity of the work that people are doing. And they don't create any ownership, both for organizations or for individuals, to think about it. Because honestly, resiliency, as I know Julie and Michael know, and they're happy to share, it's actually really messy. Like, it doesn't look pretty all the time. It's also not linear. Resiliency can happen in lots of different ways and in different paths. But as we unpack why this should matter for everybody, just want people to understand that a big takeaway here for me is that if you know those stats, if you resonate with this lived experience, you need to make sure that resiliency in your agency isn't hidden behind like hard to access resources and is accessible for people who have a nonlinear path. I mean, Michael's story really shares to us that like it should be so easy that people would trip over it in order to find the health and wellness resources for your agency. And then Julie, I know her story can really help us understand that resiliency isn't linear, which means that neither should be the health and wellness resource accessibility, right? How do you infuse that in at different ways and different times? So I want to actually really talk a little bit about the cost of silence. Something we talk a lot about in Heroes is that the cost of silence unfortunately has negative impacts for lawsuits, for conduct unbecoming, for patient outcomes, but it also has a huge impact for the health and wellness of your workforce. And one of the things that I've been really asking people in our trainings, and I'm going to ask Julie and Michael both here in a minute, and we'd certainly love to hear folks in the chat if you'd like to share, is really reflecting on the difference between miss signals and misinterpreted signals, because they both, when they're not picked up as signals, can be a cost of silence and can result in people, not understanding what is needed. But it is a huge understanding so that we understand how to train our workforce to identify them and how to get our organizations ready to do something with them. So, missed signals are really just that true, genuine, like, didn't see that coming, right? Oh, didn't know that person. And that's different than misinterpreted signals, which is, oh, I didn't think it was that bad. Or I thought they treated everybody like that. Or that's just Hank, right? Those are misinterpreted signals. Or we're ragging on people's performance and time off when underneath it is a misinterpreted health and wellness signal. So I'm curious, Julie, if I could start with you. Do you have any kind of reflections on the most common missed and then misinterpreted signals in fire and rescue specific to health and wellness?
I think sleep is really the canary in the coal mine, and there's such an epidemic of sleep loss in this field, and partially that could be kind of like a badge of honor, right? And I think back to my own experience, and in my 20s and my 30s, I loved being on really busy rigs and running those calls, and I didn't want anybody to have an emergency, but if it happened, I wanted to be there, you know what I mean? And I think I totally had that sort of attitude of I'll sleep when I'm dead. And then when I got into my 40s, I was like, my adrenals feel like shriveled up raisins and I'm exhausted and I'm feeling burnt out. And I think that, when you spend a third of your life living in the fire station with people, you have a pretty good idea how people are sleeping. If they're coming out, they're looking well rested, or if they're staggering out of their room and they're like, man, another garbage night of sleep. I think that, when we look at it, pretty much the whole diagnostic and statistical manual, the really sleep interruption and sleep problems are associated with every single problem in that book. And really, I think if fire service leaders are looking to find one thing to really focus on, it's improving fire service sleep. And to me, I really break this into two different categories of there's the sleep that you miss from running a million calls and being on the busiest rigs. And then there's the sleep that you miss because you come back and your system is really stuck in a state of hyperarousal. And I think that those are two different things. And my hope and some of my aspirations are that we can really use a double attack it from both angles, where I think a lot of fire service leaders are facing tight budgets and increasing call volumes and trying to figure out effective ways to do this. And it's ironic to me that we have sleep figured out for aviation, trains, and trucking, but for the medical field, for doctors, nurses, and for first responders, we're like, oh, you guys, we'll call them heroes and then they don't need any sleep. And it's like, that just doesn't really biologically align. And then the other thing is, I think from the very beginning in the academy, we need to be teaching people things like polyvagal theory, encouraging things like yoga, meditation, utilizing things like vagus nerve stimulators. excuse me, to downregulate the body and teaching people better sleep hygiene, and then working on station design to help lower light stimulus, to, drop the lights that are on the back of the rigs if we're going in tandem, because the strobing LED lights really wake your body up a ton. So anyway, that's I started to really go off on sleep, and the
That's
topic
okay.
was missed
I heard
signals. So go
I
ahead.
heard sleep. So sleep would be your number one. I mean, I first of all, I really just want to thank and clarify, and Danny put a great resource in the chat for Colorado as well. And I think that so what I hear you saying is that sleep can both be a missed and a misinterpreted signal. So it could be both of them, but it's like critical, crucial to pay attention to. And I also heard you're kind of offering some recommendations, and I think it's really helpful to help people delineate that when you work in public safety and criminal justice, one of the effects that we know is that the line between vigilance and hypervigilance gets really blurred, and that people start to redefine what that criteria is. So they have a new level, right, of vigilance and hypervigilance, and that I know I bet everybody in this call has heard like, hey, you should pay attention to sleep. But I think what Julie's really trying to help us here is that first of all, we can't become so used to that we're kind of dusting it under the rug of this, like, oh, everybody has bad sleep in the fire department. That doesn't need to be that way. And when we accept that as a norm, then we miss the signal. So I think that's really important. And then I think the other tip that you're offering to people, it's not just enough to say, hey, I need you to sleep better. Like organizations can take real measures in how they set up those sleep environments to help support. And then there's other things that we can do in interventions and tactics and trainings to learn how to downshift and deregulate, because a lot of people in this work almost they don't realize that they've actually forgotten how to really do it. That even when they think that they're in a relaxed environment, their biometrics are going to tell us something different, right? Like they're
Absolutely.
operating at a higher level all the time, that they no longer are tapping way down into it. But you can retrain the brain to do that. So I appreciate that. Michael, I'd love to hear from you about what you think are some of the missed and or misinterpreted signals of health and wellness in the fire department.
Yeah. So, yeah, I apologize if my answer is a little wonky. I sometimes get a little bit confused, but I guess the way I'm hearing this is like a signal, like as that I might notice in somebody as a friend or as a coworker, correct? Okay. Yeah. So, for me, I guess I tried to not rely totally on anecdotes, but because all this stuff did happen to me, it's sometimes the easiest thing to reach for. In my case, I was always kind of a dude who liked to party when I got on the job. I was always going out, right? Me and my circle of friends, the guys I worked with, we were real social. We were always going out. We were always going over to each other's houses. And so alcohol was a big part of our, existence. And by and large, I think a lot of them, I mean, you can argue like, right, any relationship with alcohol is an unhealthy one, but by and large, I think the majority of them had a reasonably healthy relationship with alcohol. And looking back, the thing that I noticed is when things went bad for me was when I stopped being out with them. And it was because I was hiding how much I was drinking. Right. And so that to me, it's like it could be a missed or misinterpreted signal, but it's one of those things it, that you kind of might not really think about it unless you're really paying attention to or looking for it. Um, but it's important, I think, that we can, from the misinterpreted signals piece, understand like what that is. And even if we misinterpret a signal, it doesn't mean that we can't go back and correct, right? And try to deal with that. And so if you see something in somebody that you care about, you can misinterpret that signal, but it's always okay to go back and try to correct that misinterpretation, right? And if something's kind of gnawing at you about somebody you care about, then it's worth looking into. It's worth diving a little deeper into, and it's worth asking some questions about. I know this is probably going to come across a little bit cheesy, and I think we've all heard it, but sometimes asking directly is the most important thing. It was shocking for me when my wife was, as I was going down my little like suicidal ideation hole, I thought I was doing a pretty good job of hiding it. Meanwhile, I was like selling everything I had, getting rid of all this stuff. Right? I was like throwing all the signals out there, isolating completely, not talking to my friends. But right before I went to rehab, my wife was like, she pulled me aside and she was like, "Hey, I know that you're planning on killing yourself." And she was like, "But would you just do one thing for me?" And that was to go to rehab ultimately. But the fact that she kind of like just confronted me with it was, I couldn't hide from it. I couldn't be like, oh, no, you're out of your mind, right? And just sometimes, if it's somebody that you care about, or somebody that you know and you have a close personal relationship with, it's okay to be forward, and it's okay to ask difficult questions that might make everybody uncomfortable. You'll be surprised at what you might uncover and what might be being left unsaid.
First of all, I'm just hit by the power of that message. And I actually would counter to say the only reason that I think messages like that still require qualifiers of this might be cheesy and corny is because we still haven't combated the stigma behind it, right? Because it actually isn't cheesy and it isn't corny, it's life-saving. And I'm also a big fan of if the behaviors and the outcomes aren't what we want, it's okay to repeat the message that it's okay to ask directly, right? Even if we've told people before. And I think about some of the things we talked about in what we train on in active bystandership training, and that is to really help people make the connection of, one of the most common reasons that people are inhibited to intervene, or AKA take out the psychobabble talk. They don't ask the direct question, like why they don't, even when they're sitting with worry, concern, is because they're afraid they're wrong. Like, what if I'm wrong, right? What if I go and ask Michael, are you thinking about taking your own life? And I'm wrong. And I would say, look, well, what's the worst outcome? That he says, no, why would you think that? Right. And then we have a conversation, right? And or what's the worst thing if I go to Jules and say, hey, I'm really worried about you. You haven't been acting like yourself. Is there something going on outside of work that, if you don't want to talk to me, is there somebody else here I can get you to connect with? And so we know that their common inhibitor to intervention is, well, what if I'm wrong? And I think when it comes to mental health and wellness, it's one of the main things we really want to blast through of just ask directly, but ask so with, the other part of the training is emotional intelligence, right? So ask so in a compassionate way, in a private way, have those resources ready to go. Don't make it disciplinary, things like that. So it's so important because we all know the difference when somebody checks in on us and they're doing it because they either have to or they have some sort of obligation, or I don't know, they're supposed to. We know the difference between that and when somebody's genuinely, as your wife was, like, I am worried about you and I want to ask you this question. Like, we know that difference, and we're actually much more forgiving about how people might stumble over those words when the intention is genuine. So I always tell people, like, you don't have to get it right, just get it out, right? Like, you can work through polishing that off at a later time, but just get it out there. So really, really appreciate that reminder, Michael. And I put some things into the chat, and one of the things I would really want people to pay attention to, Michael touched on this, but isolation is a really big one. Isolation and withdrawal, that's a concern that I always have when people are sharing that. It was just out at a community in February training, and at the end of day one, thank you, my dog would like to say something about that. At the end of day one, we had I'm so sorry. I have a little bit of a distraction happening here. You're a good girl. Sit, please. Thank you. Okay. Anyway, at the end of day one, we had somebody reach out to us to say, you know what? After your training, I'm very worried about somebody in our department who's on leave because of performance issues and burned a lot of bridges, but made a lot of statements about starting over, getting rid of all their things, saying goodbye to people. And I just assumed that other people have reached out, but I'm realizing now that that might not be true. And so can I get some help to reach out? And so, because we know that's another reason that people don't intervene is they think other people have. And that's really common in the fire department because of, people are around all the time. We always think somebody else has. So don't assume that somebody else has reached out. Ask again. We want to not miss those signals. And those misinterpreted signals are also really important, because one of the most common misinterpreted signals is performance. So I want to shift us a little bit, our questions here about why it matters for both the community, but I want to start internally. One thing that I get concerned about, and you both, and I know we have some people in the chat too who can relate to this, so would love to hear from you as well. But one thing that I worry about, and I certainly don't observe this for either one of you, but I've seen it in departments where they identify a wellness coordinator, but then that's kind of it, right? It's a check the box. They have the position, they've got the title, but they don't have anything behind it. And there's lots of reasons for this, but one reason that I think that that can happen and can be a significant risk for a department is because they didn't make the connection about why it matters. Like, why does employee health and wellness matter for a training department? Why does it matter for administration? Why should it matter for risk management? Why should it matter for department leaders? I think when you make that connection, it's harder to make resiliency a check the box. And I'm curious if either one of you, Michael, I'd love to start with you. You know, you work in the training department. I know you see this every day. And so I imagine you're thinking, like, this is pretty obvious, Abigail, but I'd like you to tell us why it matters for training the health and wellness folks.
Yeah, well, I mean, and to be clear, yeah, I don't think anybody here in the fire service thinks that, we've done anything but by and large get this wrong for a very long time. And, in many ways, we still are. Mental health is such a misunderstood or poorly understood thing, especially for the fire service, that, you mentioned that, people in the disciplinary track, right? And it's like, and then that's when they find us like, oh, but also like go talk to the resilience coordinator, go see somebody in wellness. What we try to do here is really make ourselves like, hey, we like to empower like our officers or fellow firefighters to reach out on behalf of other people. They can do it anonymously to get assistance if they see something. So it doesn't have to rise to the level of becoming a disciplinary issue. So it doesn't have to rise into affecting their careers and their professional lives. And it's one of those things that's really hard to get a hold of because the messages are so disjointed. Like you said, I wish, again, I wish I could tell you that I'm here because I'm like some brilliant mastermind of resilience and I have all these wonderful ideas. And I work for a reasonably large department. My selection was pretty haphazard. I don't know if I'd be putting a guy who's fresh out of rehab, 6 months out of rehab into this position to go like, oh, go take care of some other guys when you're very much still in that space where like you're in a dangerous place, right? Even after. And so a lot of that's just because we're not educated. It hasn't been, it costs money, right? That's the big thing. It's budgetary. It's a money sink, at least up front. And then, it doesn't really yield the results. If you don't know what you're looking for, it doesn't necessarily yield the results that you might want it to. And so a big thing for us is making sure that we are making these early investments right from the recruiting stage and from the candidate stage when they're in the fire academy, that they're getting in touch with the wellness as an overall concept, right? Not just resilience, but overall physical fitness. The importance of, we have PTs in there showing our guys how to lift every morning, which is huge because how many of like, I know in my case, 15 years ago, we were just wanting to throw the heaviest weights around in the gym. And, form was sort of part of the conversation, but there was nobody there to police it. Here, guys are getting called out by a PT the moment they have bad form. Hey, you need to drop weight. Stuff like that they can carry with them the rest of their career, which will lead to longevity and will lead to, a healthier retirement, will lead to a healthier career. It'll lead to less time off the job. And so we're trying to do the same thing with the mental health piece. We want to make sure that people are kind of familiar with like, hey, the resilience thing, right? This is not some concept that you have to come in touch with when you're struggling. The resilient piece is something that you live with every day. Resilience is about what you do every day to kind of make yourself happy, to support your lifestyle and to keep yourself going. And so take note of those things now, because when it does get hard, and it likely will get hard, make sure that you can have those things easily, in the back of your mind to kind of fall back on. I know it's a very reductive way to kind of explain it, but yeah, it's just there's kind of just so much that there's a lot of bad information out there. There is a lot of kind of misunderstanding, like you said, the stigma. And in addition to that, I think that part of it too and this is not my theory, but this is kind of a theory that I've heard that makes sense. And I, again, hate doing that, but we're so used to fixing things that it takes us a long time to realize a problem in ourselves because we think we can just fix it. And then by the time it's become an issue, it's a huge, huge issue. It's not something that we can get ahead of anymore. So there's just a number of reasons, but I hope, especially through things like this, backed by like academic research and data and good information, that we can start building up a program like the military has and like police have. We can start doing that for firefighters and first responders, because I think what's missing in a lot of this is the grounding in science that a lot of those other places might have.
I love that. As you know, I get very geeked out about the science and making sure it's evidence informed. And I agree with you. I made a note in the chat that It sounds like your key takeaway is to remember that investing in the wellness of your workforce, it's a long game strategy, not a short game strategy, right? And that and the other key message that I heard in you is that, and if you're only investing, this happens a lot in departments. If you're only investing on the negative outcome end of that, right? When people are needing rehab and they are really burnt out, it is going to be expensive. You still, however, could provide intervention there that keeps those really big ticket items from being paid out, like workers' comp, lawsuits, XYZ, et cetera. But the earlier you provide intervention, the better, right? So if you're getting people in the, in pre-hiring in the training academy, if we're teaching resiliency, downshifting, what is healthy coping skills, and then we're reinforcing that. I love that example to the PT, right? Then they're learning that early on, that that's the culture, and it stays with them. We know that prevention-based medicine, if you will, works, and that's kind of the theory that you're applying here. And there's a lot of research to support, right? When we do early intervention, we have it. It's a time-based framework of ours is early is best, but better late than never. And I hear that your message aligns. That's what the investment strategy for me. Julie, I'm curious if you have any thoughts as well around like why the health and wellness of employees should matter to kind of folks above legal, HR, risk management. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm excited that I feel like we finally are starting to acknowledge as a field, and we're actually having some real research, like the 5-year study starting in 2017 that really was looking at firefighter suicide. I think a lot of us anecdotally have known, like, man, this job can jack you up, and we seem to lose a lot of friends. But I think without data, it's hard to get financial resources, and that's really, I think that's one of the first things is like, if you address a problem but you don't allocate any real resources toward it, if you want to see what people really value, see what they're willing to spend money on. And I think that when you look at the cost, I'm not an HR person, and I'm grateful that I'm not, but when you look at the cost of terminating someone, or when we get someone to the point where they're a performance problem, or there's a wrongful death suit, as there has been in this case, or in this state, where there's a huge litigation, there's tons of bad press publicly, and then there's it comes at a huge cost, not only financially, to the reputation, to the families of whatever has happened. And I think this is where we really have to try to get ahead of it. And I think it's been fascinating to me stepping into the counselor role, where I love it when people come in early and they're like, well, I've been through a lot of stuff in my life, and I know it's a good thing. And they're coming in the first couple of the years of their career. So they're like, I want to dump out the rocks from my childhood or whatever it is. Something I was largely completely unaware of before studying psychology was that, our sense of safety is really created in childhood. And so for people that have experienced a lot of childhood trauma, on one hand, it can make you tougher because you've survived and you've learned how to adapt and function in a really dysfunctional way. And we know that in the military has higher numbers of people with adverse childhood events signing up than the general population. We don't know those numbers for first responders, but I think it's very likely that we have similar numbers, where for people who have experienced a lot of trauma growing up, they want to come and be part of helping other people. But one of the things about, if people did not feel safe growing up, they're much more predisposed to already being stuck in a sympathetic dominant hyper aroused system. And I think we really see this in our special operators in the military, where they have learned to just function for many, many years. But I think that it's really tricky. You listen to guys like Jocko saying like 4 hours of sleep, that's all you need. And it's like, well, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but that's not really backed by any sort of physiological data. So I think finding resources, for one, to prioritize it is really important. And then to encouraging people to get in early. It's really, really hard for me as a therapist if someone comes in and they're like, I'm getting divorced after decades. I'm on a performance improvement plan. I'm drinking a fifth every couple days. I'm passively suicidal. And I have a backpack full of rocks that's so heavy that I can't even stand up anymore. And it's kind of like if you waited until you had stage 4 cancer to get a primary care doc, and you're like, gosh, you're really not giving me a lot to work with here. And for people that get to that point, they really need inpatient. And I think it's hard for people not to view I am totally broken because I have to go to inpatient. Where if they had just come in, it's like if you have a cut on your arm, let's get that thing cleaned out and stitched up. Like, let's not wait until you have sepsis to deal with it, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I put a couple of comments in the chat. It helps to remind people that that's why you also need treatment available for the whole person, right? So if we are getting in more proactively, that is hugely, and I kind of built off that of also for the whole family. I mean, when people join the fire department, there's definitely an impact to their families. This for me is another big takeaway about why the health and wellness of first responders matters for the entire community. They are also part of the community, as is their family, as is sometimes their extended family. And I think Julie and I can certainly speak to some counseling outcomes of the children and youth of first responders, and that there are some very substantiated negative impacts for them as well, right? So this can be a generational impact that we can interrupt, right? With prevention strategies, early treatment. I really appreciate that reminder. I do want to kind of go briefly back to a comment that Danny had in the chat because I think it's really powerful. And Danny, just for folks who might not have their chat available, Danny's comment is the culture of accident investigation needs to be better trauma informed. We often ask why people make mistakes and stop too soon. We miss signals that could be errors in judgment for drug calculations, impacted by sleep loss, PTSD impacted work. And I really appreciate that reminder, Danny. A couple of things that is thinking about that is that another great example of missed, right? Missed signals, missed opportunities. What I really like about what you're saying though, Danny, this is a key point, is that if you really want to elevate the health and wellness culture in your agency, Julie and Michael have really talked clearly, like it can't just be a check the box wellness coordinator. You need lots of resources. You need early intervention, prevention strategies, training. You also need intense things like inpatient, EMDR, but you also need a culture that says we're going to look at health and wellness in every aspect. Because if in an accident investigation, we're looking at this from a how can we do better, that also includes how can we do better for this individual, right? Are there health and wellness reasons that they are not performing at their best? And creating off ramps for people to get what they need and not continue in those outcomes. Because the other piece I wanted to highlight, Danny, based on your comment, is it really hits to why we're here, right? Because like the most obvious example about why the health and wellness of the fire service, fire department, EMS matters is because when they're operating cognitively, physically, mental health at their best, we all have better outcomes in the communities that they're serving. And that when we have a culture that is really focused on resiliency, learning, growth mindset, active bystandership, then we can shift it away from just resources to something more meaningful. So one of the things that we're always talking to people is where are the other organizational on and off ramps for health and wellness that isn't just your training coordinator, or isn't just your wellness coordinator, right? Whether it's in investigations, whether it's in onboarding, whether it's in performance standards, leadership training. How are they talking about that? I think Michael and I had a conversation a long time ago. I don't know if you remember this, Michael, but just for me, it was, I think that anybody who goes after a leadership position in the fire department should be asked about what their philosophy is for the health and wellness of their workforce. And so how is that baked in? Folks, we are coming up close to the end of time, so we're gonna ask our panelists for one last question, and then we want to see if anybody else has questions to wrap this up. But I kind of started with the immediate one, right? The health and wellness of people working in first responders equals better responses and outcomes, right, for the community they serve. But I'm curious, Michael or Julie, if either of you have any other kind of takeaways for why the health and wellness of people working in first responders, why that should matter, even people who aren't in the first responder culture, but who are part of that community. And they're both like, no, you go. So Julie, I'll let you go first. How's that?
Well, I can't help but think of the story of kind of the thin red line, the thin blue line, the thin green line. This idea that there's a small group of people that really are keeping our civilizations from total chaos. And there's a tremendous amount of strain on those people that comes with that. And I think that for leaders, if you're here and you're looking for solutions, I think even if you don't have a wellness coordinator, if you're not really sure where to start, even if you tell your people, hey, we're going to allocate $1,000 per employee or $2,000 per employee that you can apply for, like resubmission through HR, it's confidential, and you create a kind of a list of things that people could go and utilize, therapy, modalities like acupuncture or massage, things like that, that just show that the department is prioritizing this as a priority. Even if you don't have a lot of resources, I think that that could be a great step in the right direction. And then I think if you have courageous leaders that are willing to do some of their own work and share those experiences, I think some of the biggest impact that I've had within my own department is my own willingness to speak openly about my experiences with EMDR, and people know that I get passionate talking about this stuff, and the number of times I've had guys kind of come to me 6 months later or a couple years later and say, hey, what was that weird eyeball thing you were talking about a couple years ago, or whatever, and they kind of talk to me like cloak, and I don't want to tell anybody, but I'm kind of on the struggle bus, and it's like, hey, no problem, and just really trying to normalize that, I think, is huge. But the power of our leaders being open about the fact that, like, hey, this job is hard on you, and I think that it's a tremendous strain for fire chiefs. Like some of the most I think some of the people who bear the burden the most is our chiefs. They're constantly kind of on call. They have to be in charge on these big calls that it's easy to, you almost always feel like you can walk away and do something, could have done something different. And anyway, just normalizing that and providing resources, I think, is a huge step in the right direction.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. So one of the other reasons that it matters is because that directly impacts not only outcomes and response times, but like staffing, period, right? Like we got to have enough people to do the job, and that when you're talking about that thin line, right? Like we're trying to keep it from chaos, and if we are losing people faster than we're getting them on, like that should be a wake up call to the entire community about how important this is. And I'm sure that many folks on the call also appreciate kind of some of your tips about just how to start, right? If you're not sure where to start with, connecting people with lived experience. So, Michael, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Julie. But in addition to that, like I live in the community that I work in. I live in Denver, and it's funny because it's not really something that was ever at the forefront of my mind. But I take a lot of solace in the knowledge when I think about the fire stations that'll be coming to my house, and that like I know a lot of guys. I've worked with a lot of those folks. You know, that's who I want. I live in a place where I want those guys coming to my house if something goes wrong, and because nothing's guaranteed. But man, if there's a shot, they're gonna take it. And it's important to have kind of like we need to be well adjusted, right? Because what we do is it can be risky. I don't It's a dangerous job. I don't want to overstate the danger because I think sometimes we get a little too pat ourselves in the back about that. But the reality is there aren't many careers in which you're going to get hurt if you do it for any amount of time. Firefighting is one of those. You will sustain injuries. And if you spend any amount of time on the streets, you'll sustain lots of injuries over the course of your career. It's just a fact of the job. And so the importance of having healthy people coming to break down your door, for lack of a better term, can't be overstated. I want somebody, if they have to get my kids out of my house, to be healthy and fit and well adjusted and ready to go do that crazy thing that they're going to do. And because that's what people depend on us for, right? We're not running 100 fires a day in Denver or anywhere, right? So when it counts, we have to be ready to go. We have to be ready to answer kind of that proverbial call. And so having people who are healthy in these positions matters a ton.
Really appreciate that reminder. And yeah, I think that probably resonates with a lot of people, right? Like I am also part of this call, this community, and want to make sure that every call is the best call. I appreciate that. And something you both, I think, maybe are indirectly hinting at that I think is important is also just the reputation, right? Like it matters, and when you need community trust for the work that's being done, and I think the health and wellness of the workforce is a way to do that. It's just as you stated earlier, though, Michael, it's a long game, right? It's not a short game. You gotta have a long-term strategy for that as well. Um, so we are at the end of our time here today. I could sit and chat to Julie and Michael for like hours, and I bet many people would want to hear more, but I also want to be respectful of time. We're going to hang in case there's a couple more questions that folks have in the chat. But if you need to go, we wish you all the best. We wish you health and safety for you and your department, and feel free to hit any of us up. Either on socials or on our website. If you want to contact either Julie or Michael and you can't find their info, feel free to contact me and I'm happy to put you in touch for sure. And thank you all for the work you do. And thank you so much, Julie and Michael. I always appreciate it. Thank you, Eric. Appreciate that feedback. Like I said, we'll stick around for another minute or so in case there's questions. And if not, hope everybody has a fantastic day.
Dr. Tucker, I think there is a question in the chat kind of about where to begin for smaller departments.
Thank you. I missed that. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Oh, well, you know what? Charles, I can First of all, I would definitely double down on some of the things that Julie shared for kind of, how do you start with getting some people with some lived experience, aligning that with your leadership. But I am happy to follow up with you as well, Charles, with some specific recommendations in a small, more rural department. I'm also happy to put you in touch with some smaller departments that I know about who I think have some good wellness programs, and you can connect with them. But I would say that one of the primary things I would recommend is kind of twofold, which is how are you building the foundation in the department to support wellness? That's things like policies, procedures, communication, making sure everybody knows about it, aligning with the chief, aligning with other resources, sharing that information, um, as well as what are the resources. And so some of the tips that I'm going to send to you, Charles, are very specific to like, here's a lot of examples and here's some of the non-negotiables that you should include. So I can send that to you and follow up if that's helpful. Thank you so much, Julie, for bringing that to my attention.
Absolutely.
All right, folks, we're going to sign off. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. And thank you again.
Absolutely.